What we saw in the first 5 years, as I call them, which surround Confederation, what we saw at that time was that the media was very much, there weren't very many papers that were extremely prominent. I mean, you had more papers at that time which were almost more localized. At that time, what we see now is the major media, being the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, New York Times, and of course the LA Times being the big ones. I mean, there's others like the Boston Globe and San Francisco Chronicle. But at that time, what you only really saw was the Chicago Tribune, and then you also saw the New York Times at that time publishing. And obviously back then you had articles where there were no bylines. You didn't really quite know who was writing what. And I think what happened was there's a lot of, people could basically write whatever they liked. And so you see a lot of these comments that kind of go off and you're like, where does this come from? Canada blank and all things, what does that mean? But people could write whatever they wanted, they could state their opinions and nobody held them really accountable. Now, why were they saying that at that time? There really was a sense that Canada was the frozen north at that time, that there really wasn't much there. We're looking at throughout history that Canada has always had a very significantly less populated area in terms of number of residents. So I think there has always been this sense in America that yes, for sure, we have more population, we have a big future, we've got a bright future. In the United States, you have the eagle representing the soaring animal, that soaring bird that kind of goes out and basically, it's this idea of mightiness, of we're going to make something of ourselves. And definitely at that time, Canada was seen as more of the backwaters, and it really truly was. It was also still tied to the monarchy, and which of course the United States had fought against and recently, relatively recently, had fought against and had emerged as being an independent republic. So I think what we saw was, and of course, at that time, you also saw a lot of the loyalists going up to Canada as well. So we saw this sense or perception in the United States that the Canadians were backwater people. They were the ones who couldn't hack it in the United States. They were the loyalists who went back to Canada. They wanted to stay within the British monarchy. They weren't as enterprising, as capitalist as us, and it was cold. It was pretty barren at that time. So I think that's why we see this Canada as a blank in all things. It's really interesting, though, because at that time, while you have the Chicago Tribune, while you have the New York Times saying Canada's a blank in all things, there's no future, it's just a slew of despond, I think at one point is one thing that the paper said. When you look at that, it sounds pretty depressing. And you say, well, there mustn't be anything that the United States likes at all about Canada. But at that same time, there were talks and calls for annexation. So you see this kind of, not a conflict particularly, but you do see this interesting thing happen where while they're disparaging Canada, they're also saying, hey, but we want you, because, and in saying, hey, we want to annex you, they're saying, hey, there's actually some value in Canada. There has to be, because otherwise we wouldn't desire you. And there was always, even back then, at the time of Confederation, this sense that Canada had a lot of resources. It had unparalleled resources in terms of lumber, water, fish, all of that sort of thing. And that was something the United States at that time really did see a value in. And they also at that time, I think, there were a lot of the immigrants who ended up in Canada quickly moved on to the United States. And so you see this mass migration happening as well. And I think that played into it, where some Americans might have said, hey, why are all these newly arrived immigrants to Canada coming down here? We must be better too. And I think, so there were a lot of different issues playing into it. Also at the time, there were a lot of calls in the Chicago Tribune, in the New York Times, saying that Canada should actually become a republic, that it should loosen its ties to the British monarchy, that its future actually lay in becoming a republic or joining the United States. So I think that's also where the disparagement comes in. They were saying, wait a minute, you guys, what are you doing with the British monarchy? You should become more like us, and because you're steadfastly refusing to become like us, we're therefore just going to put you down, is kind of, I think, where they were coming from.